Kevin, let's talk about diabetes, and in particularly, um, I'm Hispanic. It is a condition that's prevalent in my sector of the population, and I find it fascinating that you were able to cure yourself. And we're not talking about some mega dollar medical procedure that you went through to try to go ahead and do that. But it basically was like a trial and error, applying your knowledge, seeking the knowledge, and then making it work for yourself. So tell me that desire to conquer that and how you went about it.
So, getting back to the symptoms I was experiencing, weight loss, fatigue, polyuria, which constant urination, thirsty. I went through the typical symptoms at 17 years old of type 2 diabetes. My blood sugar, my blood glucose, they didn't do A1Cs at that time, was basically 350, which is extremely elevated. My eyesight was, compromised. So to answer your question, I wasn't feeling good, and I wanted to change that process. I had to go back to the simple foods: beans, whole grain brown rice, and the vegetables, squash. I remember in California we had zucchini that was growing. So I was very limited in my ability to eat. It is a diet of whole grains, vegetables, and protein. And a lot of people, I want to emphasize this, a lot of people think it takes a lot of money to eat healthy. No. Someone can go to the dollar store right now and buy a bag of brown rice and black beans and walk out of that store $2.50. There's a misconception to think that taking care of diabetes means you have to have a lot of money. It's the opposite. Eating the simplest foods bring about the potentiality of creating equilibrium to where the diabetes type 2 begins to disappear. Type 2 diabetes is one of the easiest, in my opinion, the easiest conditions to take care of because it's generally brought about by lifestyle, and that is primarily diet.
I just lost my best friend to diabetes. And Bobby I remember when I did his Hall of Fame induction for the Boxing Hall of Fame, I described him as having the greatest right hand in boxing, even though he wasn't a fighter, because he wrote the checks. And if he didn't write the check, we didn't have fights. But he consumed ice cream at 9 o'clock at night, and then he died in his sleep, where he went into shock and all that stuff, and then never came out of a coma. Explain that to me, what the body goes through.
So basically, glucose, when it's not entered into the cell through something called GTF, what happens is that glucose converts to sorbitol. Sorbitol is an alcohol sugar, and sorbitol begins to damage cells and nerve, the myelin sheath, which is the lining of the nerve, rapidly. That's why we see neuropathy in diabetes. That's why we see the visual changes and shifts and things like that. So when the blood sugar is so high and it can't be metabolized, the body's trying to rid it in any way. That's why the polyuria occurs. The body's saying, I've got to get rid of this unmetabolized glucose because it's dangerous for the system. Glucose is harmful if it's not metabolized into the cell, or it's not put into the cell for metabolism. And that, if it's not done correctly or quick enough, that's when alcohol sugar forms, known as sorbitol. So generally that's what we see happen. We see, ketoacidosis occur. We see a lot of these different conditions begin to occur. And symptoms that you probably are aware of with type 2 diabetes are basically skin problems, slow healing, neuropathy is a big situation, visual changes, blindness can occur if it continues on its pattern or its pathway. So to answer your question, this is why the body metabolically, if it doesn't utilize the sugar correctly, known as glucose, because that's what happens. The body, CHO, it wants to get that carbon. And what happens is the rest, water is removed and things like that, but it's that carbon, as you know, for life and everything else. Carbon is the basic running point for us as a life form. And if the body can't do that appropriately, that glucose isn't broken down and its constituents, and guess what happens? It has damaging potentiality to tissue, nerves, and that type of thing.
Now, for as complicated as diabetes can seem to be, I mean, you're explaining it in a very simple term. Bobby's case, he had all the money in the world, but he relied on that medical part of it.
Exactly.
Without doing his own due diligence to try to find the answer in the simplicity by which you were able to find through your diet change and consuming those foods that you should. And I mean, you were what, 17 years old?
17, correct.
So I mean, the knowledge could not have been that extensive at that time.
You're exactly correct. And my knowledge wasn't that extensive, but my budget wasn't extensive either. And my budget is what funneled me into eating something that took care of diet or took care of the diabetes. And that was the brown rice that I could buy for 25 cents a pound, the beans that were dried that I could prepare. And when I had the occasion to be able to buy chicken or whatever else, it was my limited financial environment that actually channeled me into eating and taking care of my diet. Completely opposite from what you hear today. People say, well, Kevin, people are not financially capable of taking care of their diabetes. And I go, what do you mean they're not financially capable? It's less expensive than having diabetes. And it's the mindset with that. There are three basic types of diabetes. Insipidus, which doesn't really have to do with blood sugar, it has to do with the pituitary gland. There's type 1 that we've heard about, where there's a death in the beta cells of the pancreas. That's generally what happens. And they're no longer able to synthesize insulin. And then there's the most common we know of today, and that's my directive, is type 2 diabetes. And if statistics indicate correctly, 1 in 3 Americans, that's tremendous. And as you brought up with the Latino community, that it's even more so than the Caucasian or African American, according to statistics. It's really a travesty.
Y para la gente que habla en español, vamos a tener una oportunidad para hablar acerca de la condición de un diabético y cómo uno puede mejorar, así que en otros podcasts, así que vamos a tener la oportunidad de traducir lo que está diciendo Kevin acerca de esa enfermedad, así que pueden estar con nosotros. But how would you classify diabetes? Is it an ailment?
Diabetes is classified as a disease, type 2. And literally it means the incapacity. It's the incapacity for the glucose to enter the cell correctly. And that has to do with glucose tolerance factor. There's other conditions as well. There's actually multiple amounts of type 2 diabetes. Causative factors: high blood fats, low GTF factor, or being able to introduce glucose into the cell. You have several different derivatives of type 2 diabetes or causative factors. So type 2 diabetes is termed as a disease right now. It's acquired disease. It's not something that is basically, if you're born with a condition, that can be life-threatening. This is almost acquired, where most pathologies we see today are acquired diseases. Diabetes falls into that category.
Let's take a look at a supermarket. If you look at it this way, the produce section is on this side. Probably makes up like 10% of the entire supermarket store. But in that produce section, there are no labels. There are no warnings. There are no, has to be consumed by such a... I mean, basically, you touch it, you feel it, you see it. And that's the freshness. That to me represents the simple part of a diet, because you can see it. It doesn't take any education. But the other stuff, you got to go through all the ingredients. You made an interesting point about the fact that if you have trouble pronouncing the ingredient, you probably shouldn't consume it.
Exactly. That's the point. My suggestion is the least touched by man the food is, the better it is. More than likely, the better it is for you. Vegetables, fish, the simplest things. And alcohol's fermented, and I understand that, and alcohol's been around for thousands of years, and people say, well, Kevin, people have been drinking alcohol for thousands of years. I said, yeah, people have been killing themselves for thousands of years. Is that healthy? It doesn't mean necessarily it's been around for a long period of time that it's been healthy. And we forget simple things like salt, the benefit of salt. Salt was so valuable in the Roman times, it was in exchange for currency, hence the name salary, from salt, basically. And what we hear about is salt reduction. You hear that all the time, right? That's too much salt, that's too much, and you're going, wait a minute, where did this come from? You're not looking at the deficiencies. You're looking at sodium excess, you're not looking at potassium deficiency. Hypertension is due to potassium deficiency. And people look at it, no, it's sodium excess. And I'm saying, wait, you're not looking at the deficiencies. It's because of low vegetable consumption that provides potassium and that type of thing. So to your point about diet, once again, once we understand and invite people to recognize what pathologies can arise from, and it doesn't have to be that expensive to prevent them or to treat them, then we enter a whole new realm. So I always think that people generally, most, are reactive, not active. And that's how I look at things. They wait until a condition happens.
Okay, so explain to me the difference between iodized salt and sea salt.
Okay, the difference with iodized is it's generally processed, and it's had a lot of the elements removed, and it has an anti-caking agent in it, generally a sugar of some sort. Sea salt should, by definition, have all 92 elements contained within. And there are different ratios. So people go, well, you're kidding me. Mercury isn't? Yes, it is. But it's in such manageable amounts that it is not toxic. It can actually be beneficial for you.
Now, we just had an incident on one of the fights that I announced where a fighter, during the physical, experienced problem with the blood. And it turned out the diet that he was following was one of consumption of fish. And he took a completely different approach to it afterwards because he found that those farm-grown fish...
Because it's not wild caught. So you bring up a very good point. It's important to look at farm-raised seafood or fish, freshwater fish like trout, and understand that they give what the feed is that they're giving. And that can follow down on the chain to you as a consumer.
You can have a sweet life.
Sure.
You just got to be sensible about what you eat.
Exactly.
That's what Kevin Meehan's here for.